Greetings, and welcome to Stuffology, where two old friends sit around and talk BS, Beatles stuff, on a track-by-track basis, pretty much for the sake of it. My name is JG McQuarrie, and I'm here with my co-host, Andrew Deacon. Say hi, Andrew.
I'm in a reflective, somber mood today, thinking about days gone by.
That's tonally appropriate for what we have to discuss, which is yesterday. So, well, certainly the biggest song I think it's fair to say we've come across thus far. Possibly the biggest song anybody's ever come across ever. But I think we should start with something off
Oh,
to a
dear
flying
listener,
start.
off mic, we've just been talking about synecdoche, mispronunciation, as a form of metaphor, and we've just gone straight from synecdoche to hyperbole.
Good, excellent. Well, I think the first thing we should do is discuss what we're not going to discuss. So, Andrew, what are we not going to discuss?
Well, we're not going to discuss the fact that at the end of the last episode, we talked about the fact that we lived with someone at university who liked Paul Simon, and we're not going to discuss that person also used to pronounce hyperbole as hyperbole. We're definitely not going to discuss that because that would be really unfair.
I don't
Okay.
remember that, but I'm glad to be
Well,
reminded of
and,
it.
and bearing in mind, we both did history. Do you remember the plant agents period?
Oh yes, the plant
History, the
agents.
plant
Yes,
agents. Anyway, moving on. We're not going to talk about eggs, scrambled or otherwise. We're not going to talk about dreams.
good.
We yeah, okay. Well, we are probably going to talk a little bit about the Beatles as a one-man band. Um, so we're going to have to mention that a little bit. We're certainly not going to mention that this is reportedly the most covered song in the history of songs, although we will talk about how irritating I find most of those covers. Actually, I can't say most of those covers because there's meant to be X number, insert large number here,
A few
and
thousand.
I can't have listened to more than 20 or 30 consciously in the last couple of weeks. I may have heard plenty of others over the years, but anyway, so we're not going to talk about that kind of stuff. We're going to talk about the string quartet. Are we going to talk about that?
I mean, if we must, but is there really any point? I mean, the
No.
thing is, the reason that we're getting all this stuff out the way is that when you come to these big songs, like everyone knows the facts about them. If you're listening to this podcast, somebody is listening to this podcast. You know that it came to him in a dream. You know that it was called scrambled eggs. Oh, how I love you have lovely legs. Blah blah blah. Like, there's no point in us repeating that because there are
And there are better
thousands of
Beatles
much.
podcasts
Yeah,
out there.
well, yeah, exactly. There are Beatles podcasts who actually care about that stuff, and this is not one of them. You know, we are here to ramble with a variable degree of coherence, and express opinion. And so there's not really an awful lot of point in us as just tracking out the same old facts that you've heard 1,000 times before. And even when it comes to like analyzing this song, it's like it's one of the most analyzed songs in the history of humanity. What are we, two middle-aged white blokes, going to say about it that a lot of other people haven't said a million times before? Probably not that much. So that's why we're getting all this stuff out of the way at the start.
Okay, that's fair enough. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. And it's yeah, good. There you go. Right. So what have we got left? Well, um,
That's the big question.
I mean, legacy. We can get into a conversation about culture, high culture, low culture, pop culture. Um, but you know what? I think the most important thing we can talk about is the amazing Australian animation series called Beat Bugs, where every episode is based around a Beatles song. Because I'm just going to read you the synopsis from the episode that features yesterday. It says, while having a birthday party, Julia accidentally leaves behind her stuffed bear Maxwell. Maxwell, that's leading to another
Hey.
song, isn't it? And her father takes him to the trash. The Beat Bugs band together to get Julie's attention before the disappearers, brackets garbage men, take him away. And it's inspired by the song Yesterday and guest starring someone called Nick Jeffries. Now, I did look up who Nick Jeffries was, and I've completely forgotten. So, yeah, anyway, but I think that to me is the nuts and bolts of the song. It's that sort of sense of intangibility. There's something that is just out of reach, that is ideal, but I've lost it. It's not quite, what's here is not quite the same as what was before. And that's fine. On the other hand, it could just be a case of someone's a bit sad because they're not as happy today as they were yesterday. There you go.
Yeah, good. I mean, obviously, we're very happy with another Beat Bugs reference, but
Oh, love
also,
it.
I kind of I like that inventiveness of like just like spinning a story out from it, and it isn't just oh woe is me for my woman has gone. You know,
Yeah.
I really appreciate that kind of approach to this because I
It's
mean
sort of Toy Story-esque in terms of plot, isn't it?
yeah, and there's nothing wrong with these things having like that slightly keening note of melancholia or whatever, and obviously that's appropriate enough for this song. There is what I kind of want to initially sort of talk about a wee bit. This is going to be slightly self-indulgent, so do forgive.
Oh,
Is kind of how I came to this song, which isn't at all from the album Help, or even particularly knowing it as a single. It was one of those songs that, of course, it's simply it exists. It's pop culture background radiation. Everybody knows it, even if you don't know it. You don't have to be conscious of coming across it. So I'm sure I had some faint awareness, but as we've mentioned, when you and I were kind of growing up in the sort of mid '80s, the Beatles were about as unpopular, if that's the right word, or certainly as unexposed as they have ever been. They were not really part of the cultural zeitgeist, and they weren't really played much. So I didn't know the Beatles version particularly, and when I was buying cassettes of Beatles stuff when I was first getting into the band, it was very much piecemeal. Either what I had left over from pocket money or whatever, or after I was 17 when I actually had my first job and I could just go out and buy
hmm.
stuff. And I didn't really have any great sense of the difference between albums, compilations, all the rest of it. So I had Sergeant Pepper was the first album I bought. I had Abbey Road, but I also had the two Rock and Roll Music volumes 1 and 2, and this is the significant bit, a collection of Beatles oldies book.
But Goldies.
Exactly. And that's where I first came across
Hmm.
Yesterday, and the context is completely different. It's just another song on that compilation, but that compilation is sort of faintly interesting because it's got weird side choices like Bad Boy on it. It's not just like, well, yeah, there are, of course, there's a lot of hits on it, but it's a weird sort of scattershot approach to their career. And on that album, it's sandwiched between Michelle and I Feel Fine, which is quite the jarring emotional change. From a bit of French fancy to some sort of English melancholia to, well, whatever heavy track you want to, or heavy handle you want to describe I Feel Fine to. And it's fine. I liked it, but I can't say that I particularly liked it more than, say, well, Michelle, which is the song that precedes it, or We Can Work It Out. The other McCartney songs in that album. I liked it, but that's all I did. I wasn't moved to tears by it, and it was much much later that I suddenly realized, oh, actually, this is one of the great totems of 20th century popular culture. That's just not the impact it had on me when I first heard it.
That's quite interesting, actually. I'd sort of assumed that maybe I mean, I had Oldies but Goldies on tape as well, and I sort of assumed as we were talking that it must have been released around the same time that Yesterday was released in the UK as on an EP, which I think was '76, but actually it was much more contemporary. That it was effectively, it filled a gap um, when the Beatles were in the process of recording Sergeant Pepper, and EMI needed something to release in December '66. So that's quite interesting, and early days of those kind of compilation type albums. But yeah, I think it's one of those that you just know about. It's almost you are born and there are certain things within culture that you in Britain in the '70s and '80s you became aware of, such as, Andre Previn on Morecambe and Wise, playing all the right notes, but not necessarily in the right order. The two Ronnies doing their backwards mastermind sketch or answering the next, that sort of thing. And Yesterday sort of exists like that as well. And I think it's very much the kind of song that you probably would have heard in the car while your mum's driving you to see your grandparents in the school holidays on Radio 2. It just sort of existed in that realm with, ironically, the likes of Mantovani, which allegedly was the kind of instrumentation that McCartney was looking to avoid in the orchestration that followed. It's just there. It's totem is an interesting word that you used. It's that flagpole of culture that is there, and I think as a result of that, it gets a meaning that is far more important than it deserves, but also then it gets more negative reactions than it deserves as well. And when you're referring to the Beatles in the 80s, I think there were lots of people, because having punk gained much greater significance in the late 70s than it actually deserved in terms of the number of people who listened to it and the number of records that were bought. But even after, in that post-punk era, there was still that focus much more on the modern and the electronic, for example, than there was on harking back to something from the 60s. So I think it was not so much derided, but perhaps it was more kind of just sort of gently ignored, and probably coincided with one of McCartney's more fallow periods post Tug of War, for example. And I suppose the single Pipes of Peace, the album's not very good, is it? Pipes of Peace.
Oh, it's dreadful. No, it's terrible.
Fair enough. And Press to Play and that sort of thing. And George was in the process of working his way back later in the 80s with Cloud Nine and being resuscitated by Jeff Lynne. But yeah, there was it was there. Yesterday was there, but the Beatles weren't really kind of thought of in that way. So it's interesting, and I think some of that, I'm going to have to talk about covers.
All right, then.
Some of that is the fact that it was a staple of, if you like, the cabaret circuit, and those kind of pop singers who decided that they wanted to be very kind of earnest and sincere and sing a weighty song with all their might. And therefore, Yesterday becomes something that it isn't in the original recording. In the original recording, it's a very simple, straightforward, heartfelt performance supported by relatively understated orchestration. But with the exception of one that I've listened to, I'll mention in a moment, then once you get the introduction of say, for example, the tinkling piano and the backing singers, in particular the backing singers, Elvis, it then becomes so earnest and overwrought, and there's just so much goddamn emotion that I think when people cover it, they end up covering the covers rather than covering the McCartney version of it. And I think that's such a shame, because if you watch him sing it, say, for example, on the Ed Sullivan Show in August 65, it's sweet. It's really sweet and lovely. And he's singing it in a very kind of modest way. Whereas, Sinatra, Jones, and Presley, and all of those singers, they're very deep and earnest and sincere. And as a result, it sounds like a parody.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think it's the great problem with all of the cover versions is that and I say all of the cover versions, obviously I have also not listened to over 2,000 cover versions, but they by and large miss the point. I think in many ways, Yesterday is kind of the apotheosis of that approach that the Beatles have to have a little bit of something for everyone. It's I think you can draw a direct line from, say, Yesterday to something like Till There Was You, for example. It's that idea that it is providing a spot on the album that your mum might like, or that an audience who aren't, like deeply invested in like contemporary pop music of 1965 are going to lap up. But you've got this really sweet, charming little ballad, and it's that kind of thing. You're producing songs for an audience that isn't necessarily your audience,
Yeah.
and the fact that this song has gone on to be covered by such vastly disparate artists and such vast numbers kind of, I think, reinforces that it's a very accessible song for a very wide range of people. It's not just something, this isn't just a Beatles song. And I think Help is kind of the end of that. I think once we get into Rubber Soul, everything is just the Beatles. But I think Yesterday is kind of the peak of that, kind of like, well, here's the gentler kind of number that your mum might like, or that your gran can appreciate, or whatever. And I don't mean that. That sounds pejorative, and I don't I don't really mean it to be. Like when I say it's the apotheosis of that, like it really is. It's the whole
Mm.
thing that it's achieved. This place that it has as a totem of popular culture is precisely because no other song has been able to achieve this in the same way. It's an astounding achievement.
I think um, a modern equivalent, I'm going to use the word modern, in terms of song that has suddenly been covered by um, lots of singers. And when I say singers, just imagine I'm putting those in block capitals. They're not just singers; they're singers. Is Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah?
Yeah, very good
And it just
comparison.
seems that anyone who wants to demonstrate their singing chops now has to sing Hallelujah. Although interestingly, you would say that predominantly Yesterday is that sort of male voice to it, whereas ironically it seems to be lots of female singers that take on Hallelujah, and I wonder if that's not so much a reaction to the original song, but a reaction to the very kind of sensitive, heartfelt, vulnerable version that Jeff Buckley did. Which and I wonder if sometimes, a bit like I was saying, that I think now people are covering the
Yeah,
covers of it.
absolutely.
I wonder if people are covering Hallelujah because they're like influenced by Jeff Buckley, man, in it. I have to say, Jeff Buckley's cover of Hallelujah is just one of the best things ever. It is phenomenal. But Jeff Buckley, phew, there's a podcast. Man, that he could sing. Anyway, moving on. Yeah, so there is a cover version that I do like, and the reason why I like it is because the person that does it is not doing a version of it. In that sense, they're doing their own take on it and fitting it in with their oeuvre, and that's Bob Dylan. There is a Bob Dylan cover of Yesterday that's great because he makes it sound like Bob Dylan rather than trying to make it sound like a big singer doing a big song. And that's what I want. But I think it's very difficult for people to put their own stamp on it. And I think it's almost that sense of when the legend takes over and a song becomes mythical, then it's really hard to fight against it. And as a result, people don't.
I think that's why I'm really glad I came to this song without any kind of cultural baggage attached to it. Seeing it squeezed in between Michelle and I Feel Fine just makes it another song. So I came to it relatively unencumbered by the the mythology of the song,
Mm.
and it is a nice song. It's a really well written song, and it's the kind of vulnerability that McCartney doesn't do very often, but when he does, it's very striking. It's effective. It's not a lyric which is trying to be very clever. Like in the last episode, we talked about "I've Just Seen a Face" and the fact that the rhymes don't always come at the end, and it's got nice kind of lyrical construction to it. Yesterday doesn't have that, but it derives its power from its simplicity, and that's great. And McCartney, like it's basically a one take wonder, but he absolutely nails it. And that fragility, that vulnerability comes through in a way that if you try and play it any other way, it kind of gets lost. It is something which is kind of unique to the way that he does. I like Dylan's cover as well, for what it's worth. I know
Mm.
we're not sort of going into cover versions in great detail, but I think it is effective because it sounds like Dylan, and that's fine. But again, it's just like Dylan, like an acoustic guitar and a voice. That's kind of his thing at this point. So the fact that he can cover a song which is just an acoustic guitar and a voice, that's logical. Most people just flatten it, and you can't really, bombastic versions of this don't work. So it's both the most covered song ever, but it's also a song which, in many ways, kind of defies covering because
Yeah.
almost everybody who takes it on loses the essential essence of what makes it a good song in the first place.
I wonder if part of the appeal is our natural inclination towards nostalgia as well, in that it's a nostalgic song. Ironically, it's a nostalgic song about one day ago, or whatever yesterday is meant to represent. But we are constantly I mean, we're doing it now, folks. I mean, we're constantly harking back when things were better. You know, and that's sort of a natural, especially in uncertain times, it's a natural trope to pick up on and develop. And I think that's why a song like My Way becomes so important. Much more than this, I did it my way. Let's reflect, let's look back on what has happened. Um, and so as a result, we can all buy into that, because we can all buy into the uncertainty of what's going on at the moment, but think about those times that have just gone. Think, oh, wasn't that nice? I mean, not only we did it about the Beatles, but we've been talking about, you know reminiscing about our university days as well. There's so many different ways in which we do it. But I think that's also then quite interesting, because this does come at a very interesting point in Beatles history. So that, the fact that they are beginning to develop different things in the studio, starting to introduce different instrumentation. They're starting to think about having the tapes rolling rather than just when they're recording. So there's more that's being captured, and they're spending a bit more time in the studio as well, and they're starting to think about not touring as much, or they're certainly not enjoying touring as much. So we're reaching that point where you could argue, and I'm sure cultural critics will argue, that they are, starting to think about that point of yesterday as opposed to where they are today. So maybe McCartney's subconsciously tapping into lots of different things. But we're also at a really interesting point in British culture as well. We have Harold Wilson's Labour government, and as a result, we have Harold Wilson, I, fairly shamelessly, and I can even say that as someone who, admires a lot of what he tried to do, fairly shamelessly nominating them for MBEs. Now, the MBE, they would have known about this nomination for several weeks beforehand, but it's actually only publicly announced 2 days before they go into the studio to record yesterday. So it's a coincidence, but it's a really interesting coincidence, and it marks that sort of point in culture where people from the old England, if you like, the old Britain, start to kick up a fuss about the significance of the award. If we're going to give it to these people whose music is terrible. But Harold Wilson isn't just a lone voice saying it. There was actually in Parliament, not a debate, but an early day motion. An early day motion is basically a group of MPs coming together saying, we want it put on record that we support this or we oppose this. So in the week we're recording this, for example, there's an early day motion that was signed by 7 MPs congratulating the winner of the 2024 Great British Bake Off. Now, they are used for more serious things, but I'm just going to read you the one that was put down in 1965. The early day motion was that this House, recognising the great good and happiness that the Beatles have brought to millions throughout the world, and recognising that they are the first entertainment group that has captured the American market and has brought in its wake great commercial advantage in dollar earning to this country, strongly appreciated the award to the Beatles of the MBE. That's really interesting. because it's also saying, well, that firstly they're an entertainment group, that's fine, but that they are also an economic unit and they can recognize the trade advantages. So, you've got a lot going on here. Now, of course, when we were talking about the 80s, and the Beatles were seen very different, almost sort of a complacent kind of, oh, well, that's not modern culture, that's not pop culture anymore. It's almost towards the end of high culture of the pop industry, and as a result it don't speak to the youth, man, does it? Because we've got our Casio keyboards and our Roland emulators, and also I'm mauling all sorts of things here, and that's perfectly fine. But it's an interesting journey from Mantovani through to the Beatles, through to youth culture and the teenager, through to recognition in the House of Commons, through to Paul McCartney getting a knighthood. If we look at where we are now, and I think yesterday plays a significant part in that, because it would have said to an awful lot of people, look how serious they are. They're musicians.
It's definitely a move in that direction, and not one that you could necessarily say ascribe to. Let's take a song at random. Act naturally. It is something which seems to have a greater emphasis on loss and on meditation and all this kind of stuff. But it's hardly the first song to have ever done that either. I
No.
mean,
Oh, the
you
first Beatles song.
no, I mean, I was going to say Heartbreak Hotel, if you want to go back that far, is
Yeah.
pretty much in a similar sentiment, but it's using a different metaphor. It's a common theme, and yet there's something about yesterday that has managed to eclipse pretty much every other song that has ever expressed that emotion. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best example of it, but it is the biggest example of it. That seems undeniable. There's a sense in which the way that we have come to appreciate the Beatles has gone through several different critical phases. And the critical phase that would have existed when we were listening in the 80s would have been a shrug. It would have been, okay, but that's kind of like old man music. Now we've got we have electronic music, we have new romantics, we have the emerging goth scene, we have post punk. That's the kind of thing that was occupying the charts when we were teenagers, and that was kind of forgotten. And like McCartney was still touring, and the Stones were still about, and all the rest of it. But back then people were making jokes about how old Mick Jagger was. Never mind, making them now when he's in his 80s. And the Beatles have gone through all these different phases of sort of critical appreciation. McDonald is the first phase, but it has gone on and on. Reassessment with Anthology, reassessment yet again. When George Harrison died, reassessment again. When the new singles come out, all that kind of stuff. But yesterday has kind of almost been immune to that kind of critical reassessment. It's always been regarded pretty much exactly as we still regard it now, which is, yeah, it's a classic.
Yeah, and not without reason. It was used as the title of the Richard Curtis film, or What If the Beatles Didn't Exist? And there's that kind of nostalgic element to that. There is that sense that we romanticize these things, just as in the same way as you would, even though the film was called Yesterday, the big kind of emotional pulling on the heartstrings was always going to be when he goes and visits someone called John Lennon. Let's look at what he looks like now. The Beatles never existed. It's fine. We romanticize those things we no longer have. So people will always romanticize John Lennon more than, say, McCartney, because we have McCartney. And that's fine. That's different people's interpretation, and it's always going to be that way. And I was going to say that actually, if you want to have a look at it, I think that this song is more kind of like a continuation of McCartney's songwriting of something like And I Love Her, for example. You can see that there's a link, or even to Lennon's If I Fell. You know, there's links there to what they're already doing. And it's sort of interesting that in order to reminisce about yesterday, and if we want to sort of put that in Beatles terms, the thing that people reminisce about would be both the Cavern Club and then also Hamburg from that period. He's not using that style of music to do it. He's using that more, you know, one for the grandparents kind of thing, which is part of his oeuvre. You know, he does that, and that's fine. One of the things that I find interesting about it is that back in that period in the 80s, when I was still sort of developing, you know, my own thoughts on music, I always found it really, really weird that there were members of some bands that barely did anything, or that bands would release songs on which very few members of the band actually played. And I can remember, or rather, I have a memory, it may not be a correct one, of watching Jonathan Ross's The Last Resort and Simply Red were on it playing Holding Back the Years. I think it was that song, and sort of thinking, well, there's only a couple of them out there. Where's the rest of the band? Why aren't they doing something? And then also, you know, we had in the early 80s bands like ABC and Spandau Ballet who had saxophone players in. What a luxury. What are they doing half the time? God, they must be making a fortune. And then so to have the Beatles um, performing when for a band, a group, they're quite happy for it only to be the one person playing is a really interesting idea, and especially because, you know, the others basically said, well, we can't add to this, so we won't add to it. And then that's why the performance on the Ed Sullivan Show in August is significant, because it's not at the start or the end of the set, it's part the way through. George comes up to the mic and introduces the song, and it's just Paul. They all go off stage. He sings. Whether or not he's playing live, I don't know, but there's certainly piping in the string quartet in the background, and then the band come back on. That's a really interesting idea. I don't know if that had been done by any other bands at that point, although of course you're probably aware that some of the other bands, perhaps some of the playing wasn't necessarily by the people in the band. Anyway, much like the many covers of yesterday, I've prattled on for far too long. I'm going to catch my breath. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, it's kind of interesting because this sequencing of the three songs in the album. So you could Tell Me What You See, I've Just Seen a Face, and Yesterday, and each one reduces the number of people that are performing until you take it down to just McCartney. Okay, we put the string quartet to one side, but as far as the Beatles are concerned, each one just gradually strips back and then strips back and then strips back. So you have that sense of which you know, the layers are being pulled back. You have that sense in which we are starting to reveal more and more about how the band function and what the band need to function. There's, you know, we mentioned in the last episode the fact that there's no bass line on I've Just Seen a Face. That doesn't really detract from the song, but it's interesting because it's especially on a McCartney song, because he's the bassist. He's such a prominent feature of what he does, and, you know, an astonishing bassist even at this point in his career. But there's no bass line on it, and Yesterday takes that approach to its sort of logical conclusion, where there's just not anything. It's just him and a guitar. So that gradual kind of revealing of more and more of what kind of lies inside of the core of what can function and still, because, you know, that's the thing, it's still legitimately a Beatles song. When we get to the White Album, we'll start to talk about songs where there's just one member on or whatever, and they don't necessarily all cohere as Beatles songs. But Yesterday does. It sounds like a Beatles song. Now, some of that, of course, is the strings. Some of it is the way that George Martin has produced it. Some of the way, yeah, all that kind of stuff. That's fine. But it's still, at its core, a Beatles song. And I really like that insight to that gradual paring back. And we'll talk more about this when we get to our discussion of the album in full. But I think it also helps to emphasize that feeling of exposure, of vulnerability within the song, because we've had this gradual reduction in what we have to listen to, while still remaining true to the core of what the band is.
I think it would be a more interesting album if it was the last song. I think, you know, Dizzy Miss Lizzy is really only there because they have regularly put, or the sequencing has regularly required something of a rocker at the end. But it is interesting that, you know, again, setlist.fm, it's crowdsourcing information, so there's no guarantee that it's accurate. However, certainly for Help, um, it's only yesterday Ticket to Ride and Help that made it into the set list in 65 and 66. And of those three, yesterday is the one that they played most, which I think is really interesting. That could be because it has that interesting change in the set, you know, change of tempo. Everyone can go off for a couple of minutes, have a little breather, and then come back on, and then they can go for it again. But you know, so whatever people might have thought of it, you are right in that it is much more of a Beatles song than, say, for example, Julia, I Will, or Blackbird, which are, you know, solo Beatles tracks on Beatles albums, for example. But then that also reflected a time when they were much more fractured in terms of their personalities. One thing that is interesting, I think, yeah, we said that it was recorded on June 14th. Bear in mind that was also the same day that not only did they record I've Just Seen a Face, they also recorded I'm Down. What a risk they were taking. I'm Down followed by Yesterday.
Yeah, you'd think those would be very much be done in the opposite order.
Yeah, especially bearing in mind the experience of Twist and Shout from Please Please Me.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, you know, no more to add, Your Honour. No more to add.
Interesting fact to end on.
Oh, that's a good point. Hang on a minute. Let me just check my many notes. Dum, dum. I think I've got there. Yeah, and you can edit that bit out if you particularly want to. Look, you know, we know that this is a really significant song, and you know, but then the problem is with the Beatles is that out of, say, 200 songs, you're going to have 20 or 30 really significant songs, canonically agreed significant songs, and then other people are going to draw in the whole kind of, oh yeah, but I think this, or, you know, I think that. But you can't argue with it because it's a little bit of perfection, a little bit of pop perfection, which means, of course, that I'm going to give it 8 out of 10 because that's what you give pop perfection.
Well, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Oh God, yeah, probably should have thought about what score I want to give it. You know what? I think I'm going to follow suit. I think I'm going to give it 8 as well.
It's no golden slumbers.
I was going to say, and not just for the sake of laziness or because I haven't thought it through, but I think that's probably fair. Good. I think we did all right in this one, you know.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, but there's plenty of waffle in there. So, you know, well done if you've got this far in ploughing through the incoherent rambles of two middle-aged blokes who really should know better.
but clearly don't.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Well, this after all, this
at
is
least
just
we haven't just talked about the usual stuff, so I think that's
no,
good.
that's true. But let's face it, what people are listening into is two people who've been friends for a long time who really don't want to talk about their emotions and what they think of the world. So instead, they picked upon a topic that they both know a little bit about, and it's standing in. It's standing in. It's a metaphor for us talking about our lives.
Good, yeah, that's it exactly. And before we risk scraping up against anything else which might potentially impact us, I will just do the social media stuff. So you can really contact us. You can really get a hold of us. This is not going well. You can get us by email. We are Beatles at gmail.com. We're on whatever is left of Twitter at Beatles_ology. And we are Beatles Stuffology on Instagram. And you can find my blog at www.jgmcquarrie.scot. Please like, rate, and review us on whatever podcatcher you're using so that other people can find the show. Next episode, we drag the album screaming and kicking to a conclusion with Dizzy Miss Lizzy. And as always, we hope you're going to join us for it. But until then, keep listening.